Hey everyone, it's Paul here. So I've been doing video tutorials over at groove3.com for probably over a year now, but I've never really done anything with this channel in the way of tutorials or certainly speaking videos. So this seems like a pretty good time to change that, and hopefully it'll be more of a regular thing. So I'm going to start with a quick video on a few tricks that I used to create a synthwave style groove in my favourite DAW, Reason 10. And this is actually the software that was used to make the Zeta album that my partner Katie and I and our singer Dan Tompkins of Tesseract put out last year. So if you haven't checked that out, I'm going to put a link in the description below. So 16th note bass lines are kind of a typical feature of the genre. And to start with, I'm going to use one of the new synths in Reason 10, Europa. Now I'm going to start by changing the waveform to a square wave shape using this wavetable position control. And this is going to act as my sub layer, and I find that square waves make for good subs as they're harmonically a bit more interesting than sine waves, and I also want to give a bit of a Juno flavour to the sound. Next, I'm going to turn on phase sync, and this basically just means that every time I press a key, the waveform is going to start at the beginning of a cycle and not part way through, and this is just a good tip for getting consistent attack in your bass patches. Next, I'll turn on oscillator 2, and then pitch it up an octave, and choose the sawtooth wave. And you should also be able to hear that with the phase sync disabled for the second oscillator, you get this nice kind of interplay between oscillators 1 and 2, whereas if I was to turn it on, everything kind of just starts at the same time and sounds a little bit stiff. Next, I'll enable unison mode for oscillator 2, and then I'll just bring the voice count down to 3, and also rein in the stereo spread just a bit. I'm also going to enable a waveform modifier, and for this I'll use faded sync. And you'll hear it's got a kind of cool flange sound going on. I can also quick route several common modulation sources to control the amount of the wave shaping, but for now I'm going to leave it pre-routed to LFO1. And then I'll just bring the speed of that LFO down so we get this nice kind of broad sweeping motion with the wave shaper. Next, I'll set the patch up as monophonic, so I'm going to set the key mode to retrigger. And then I'll dial in an amp envelope with a sort of short, plucky decay and release. And this tends to work really well for 16th note bass lines. The next thing I want to do is add some filtering. So to do that, I'll route oscillators 1 and 2 to the global filter. I'll disable key tracking so the MIDI note value has no bearing on the frequency cutoff. And then I'll increase the amount of envelope modulation to filter frequency. And you'll see here on this assignment slot that the modulation is being taken from envelope 2, so I can switch to the editor for envelope 2 and then just draw in my own custom shape. I'll also disable the sustain point as we don't need it for this bass. Now obviously there's a lot of scope to adjust this further, and I can make changes to it as I add extra instrumentation, but for now I think that should do the job. Now to get that 16th note feel, I could try to play it in, or I could program it using the mouse, but instead what I'm going to do is use an arpeggiator. So I'll drag in the arpeggiate monophonic arpeggiator into the rack. So now my MIDI keyboard is routed to this second device instead of Europa. And if I flip the rack, you'll see that Europa is now being controlled by CV cables. And if you're not familiar, CV is just a term that's used in modular synthesis for small amounts of voltage that can be used to drive inputs on things, such as filter frequency amounts, pitch, pretty much anything you can think of really. So for example, gate is just telling Europa when to play, and CV is telling it which pitch to play at. So I'm going to go ahead and sequence in a basic progression using the arpeggiate, and I'll just switch to the arranger view by pressing F7. Now I can play additional notes over that bass line to arpeggiate it further. And I can control this even further by setting the arpeggiator mode to manual. So the notes will be arpeggiated in the order that I play them. I'm going to put my overdubs onto a new note lane with numpad 3. And I just do this so I can bring them in and out of the arrangement easier and just experiment with different layouts. And obviously I could tweak that a bit further, but it should do for now. The next thing I'll do is lay in some drums, and for that I'm going to use the L1M, which is an emulation of the Lindrum by Quad Electra. And to begin with, I'm just going to lay down a super simple drum beat. As with the bass track, I'll create a new note lane with numpad 3, and then I'll just put my hi-hats on there. And rather than play for the entire 8 bars, I can just grab this single part and then Control D to duplicate. And a couple of quick changes I'll make. First of all, I'll bring the hi-hat level down on the front panel of the L1M. And also just shorten the decay of the envelope curve assigned to the filter. Now so far it's okay, but what I really want to do is make that bass sit in nice and tight with the drums. And there's a fantastic rack extension for this called Pump. So I'm going to drag this in as an insert on the bass by placing it in between the device and the mix channel. And this will just open up the insert effects slot. Now for a press play, you'll hear that I've got some instant 4 on the floor sidechaining. And I can raise or lower the floor of the pumping effect just to control the intensity of it. Okay, now if we listen to the final bar where the kick drum drops out, to my ears the sidechaining effect is a little bit overpronounced. So what I'll do is I'm going to alternate and click on the floor control, and this will create a new automation parameter for it. And then for this final bar, I'll just draw in a new part and just raise the floor a tiny bit. And if you're coming from Cubase or another DAW like that, you might notice that one really nice thing is that when the automation clip finishes, the parameter returns to its initial value. And you can actually see what the initial value is if you double click on the automation part. This grey line here signifies what value it'll return to when there's no automation present. And you can also change that value throughout the duration of the song as well. Okay, so it's a good start, but the drums could sound way fatter. And I'm going to use additional mix channels to process the drums individually. To do that, I'll head over to Utilities, and I'm going to drag in 2 mix channels, one for the kick and one for the snare, and then flip the rack again with Tab and route bass to the first mix channel and snare to the second. Now if we listen to the kick on its own, it's kind of boxy and dull. So there's a couple of things that I could do to this. First of all, I'm going to apply some EQ by pressing on the Spectrum EQ window button, and then I'll enable the EQ and also enable E mode, and this just allows for more precise Q factors on the parametric bands. I'll also add a tiny bit of high shelf. and also introduce some high pass filtering. And the reason I'm doing that is we're going to treat this kick drum as two layers. So we can think of this first one as the attack portion of the kick. Now if I right click on this mix channel, I can choose create parallel channel. And now what I have is an unprocessed duplicate of the kick channel that can be affected separately. If you find that a sample lacks low end or sub, there's a really simple trick you can use using a low pass filter. So I'm going to go to Effects, and then I'll drag this filter in as an insert. I'll begin by bringing the frequency control down until we're left with just the low end. And then I can use the resonance control on the filter to really kind of bring that frequency out. The last step is to group and process both the attack and sub portions of the kick together. And to do that, I control select both of these channels, and then I hold Control and G to put them on their own bus. And now I can add things such as compression, as well as a bit of tape saturation. Now before I move on, I'm just going to get myself a little bit organized visually. So to do that, I'll hold alternate and collapse any device to collapse all of them. And then we'll just go ahead and rename this to kick group, snare, kick. And you'll see that it's also renamed the parallel channel automatically. Now for these devices here, what I'm going to do is change the label on the actual device. And this is just to preserve the name link between the mix channel and the device itself. If I was to choose a different name for the mix channel, so we'll just call it test, you'll see that it's broken the link between the device and the mixer channel name. If I want to reinstate that link, I can just set the name to blank, and then the mix channel will assume the name of the device again. So we'll call this drums, and then bass arp, and bass. So that just leaves the snare to process, and I'm going to begin by adding in an RV7000 reverb. I'll bring the wet-dry balance down, and also activate the built-in gate. Now from here I could open the remote programmer and make all sorts of changes to the character of the reverb, but for now I'm just going to go to the gate section and just give it a bit more of an abrupt cutoff. And then as with the kick, I'll use the Spectrum EQ window to just dial out a bit of the mud and make it a little bit brighter. I'm also going to go to the mixer and bring in the stereo spread of the snare, as I tend to find that really wide reverbs on drums can sort of diffuse or smear them, and it might be what you want in certain contexts, but here I don't think it works so well. Now, one other really cool thing I could do is add a layer of white noise underneath my snare. To do that, I'm going to drag in a subtractor synth, and I'll just put it in its own column so we can see what's going on a little bit better. Now the noise generator on Subtractor shares a channel with oscillator 2, so I'll set the mix all the way over to the right and then enable the noise generator. I'll set the patch up as monophonic and then just increase the decay and release times. I'll also lengthen the filter envelope to match the amp envelope. So as with the arpeggiate that's used to control Europa, we're going to use control voltage or CV, but we'll just do a little bit of manual patching. So I'll press tab to flip to the back of the rack, and then I'm going to take the gate output from snare and route it to the gate input of the subtractor. And lastly, I'll just rename this to snare noise layer. And I can also group this together with the snare channel as well. So I'll hit F5 to go to the mixer again. And we'll control select these two channels and group them. And I can also bring that channel in next to the snare on the mixer as well. You might also notice that the order of the devices in the rack is different than it is in the mixer. So what I can do is I can just select all of these channels and then right click and choose sort selected device groups. And now you see here that the order of the channels reflects what's in the mixer view. So I can actually just bring these down underneath here. Okay, so finally I'm going to add a couple of extra layers of instrumentation. Firstly, I'll drag in radical piano. And I'll begin by turning this character control all the way up to full, so I get a brighter, almost digital kind of sound. I'll also turn the compression all the way up, so we have a nice sort of slammed sound. Next, I'm going to add a nice deep wide chorus from Synapse Audio. I want to get that sort of 80 sound, so I'm going to increase the delay, but bring the rate down so you don't get that kind of wobble too much. I also think a nice long reverb would sound great on this too, so I'm going to use another Synapse rack extension, the deep reverb one. And then I'll just sequence in a basic sort of melody or motif. Next up I want a kind of arpeggio layer, and for that I'm going to use the old favourite Thor. And for this patch I'm going to do something super simple, so as with the bass I'm going to choose mono retrigger mode. And again just give myself that nice sort of short plucky amp envelope. And I'll do the same again with the filter envelope. And I'll just increase the amount of envelope modulation to filter frequency. I'll also add in a second oscillator, and for this I'll just choose the square wave. And of course route that second oscillator to the filter so I can hear it. And again I want that kind of slightly Juno type sound, and one characteristic of that is the use of pulse width modulation. So if I grab this pulse width control and move it as I play, you get that nice sort of phasing in and out effect. Now obviously there's no quick routing for modulation as there is on Europa, but I can use the modulation table to select LFO1, and then we'll set the destination as oscillator 2 pulse width. So I'm going to go ahead and record in some notes, and then we can just make a few extra tweaks to the sound. So I think it could stand to be a little bit pluckier and shorter overall, so I'll bring the filter frequency down and increase the filter 1 envelope amount. I also be cool to have that frequency cutoff amount move over time. So again, I'll alternate click to create some automation, and then I'll draw in a new part. And what we'll do is we'll go from the current value to something a little bit higher. And then I can just duplicate this and reverse it. And lastly, for this sound, I think I'll add a bit of delay, and I can actually use the delay that comes built into the device itself. So we'll just enable tempo sync, and I'm going to solo this so I can hear what it's doing, and then just sort of set this up until it's where I want it. And then of course I'll just go ahead and name this. One final thing I'll do is just add in a layer of chords underneath this, and for that I'm going to use the G-Force Retron, which is an awesome emulation of the Mellotron, and it actually uses samples taken from the original library as well, which is really cool. And I think for this I'm going to use the combined choir sound, and then I'll just go ahead and record that in. And I want that sample to restart on every bar, so I'm just going to go in and make sure that these are all exactly 1 bar in length. And I can actually do that by selecting all the notes, pressing F8 to go to my toolbox window, and then we'll just set a fixed length of 1 bar. And then again, I'll go ahead and duplicate that across the entire range with Control and D. And then lastly, I'm going to reuse the pump sidechain effect. But this time I'm going to set it to half time. And then I'll just call this chord pump. Now obviously this is just a start. There's a couple of issues there really, a bit of clashing between the bass arpeggio notes and the higher arpeggio, but that's something that you would kind of spend a little bit more time fixing, and it wouldn't really make for a very interesting video. The very last thing I'm going to do is some really quick and dirty mastering. So I'm going to use a free VST effect called OTT from Xfer Records, who also make the Serum synth that you might be familiar with. And I'll bring the depth down to about 30%, scoop it a little bit and give it a bass boost. And then I can go ahead and chuck in a maximizer just to bring up the level a bit. And I can also enable some look ahead to prevent clipping at the output stage. Now obviously that's just a really rushed job on the master bus there, so please no comments from actual mastering engineers. I know I'm doing it wrong. But really it's just to show that if you have a VST that you like to use for mastering, you can incorporate that into the chain really easily along with stock devices, rack extensions and whatever else. So that's about it for this video. Like I said, I hope to do more on this channel in the future. So if there's anything that you'd like to see me cover specifically or any questions about this video, you can just let me know in the comments. But hopefully you found this useful if you're a Reason user, or even if you're just looking over the fence wondering what all this Reason stuff is about. So until next time, cheers for watching.